So I guess I'll be talking about the thinking process behind Sonic Adventure in 5 million minutes, the making of, if you will, or dissected, whatever. Okay, first the title. See, a long time ago I bothered trying to give these parodies the proper amount of minutes in the videos, with people always whining and complaining that I'm a split second off, and to be frank, I hate and despise those people from the bottom of my heart, so ever since Sonic Lost World in minutes, I pretty much never bothered to give the proper minute count anymore, and I'm just screwing around with people. The way I see it, it's like a hidden test. Like, when it's 5 million minutes wrong, that's clearly wrong, right? That's realistically impossible to do unless I'm really gonna have a video that goes on for 10 straight years. So you'd have to assume people seeing the title must know it's an attempt at a joke. Not even a funny or clever joke, just an attempt at a joke. Because, it's a cartoon parody, so there are jokes there, right? And if you look at it and go, oh, that's probably just Roger being silly or some ill attempt to a stupid gag, congratulations! You have been graduated in thinking sarcastically, and from a comedic perspective, you're officially capable of watching this cartoon. Because the entire cartoon needs to be approached from a loose or organic perspective, being capable of recognizing sarcasm, double meanings, symbolic representations, it's all part of the experience. But if you're genuinely upset that the amount of minutes promised is incorrect, then you probably shouldn't watch this cartoon at all, you're probably too literal-minded. This is a parody with satirical overtones, not a direct representation. So sorry, if you're that literal-minded, you're mentally incapable with my insanity. So the general parody. With these cartoons, finding individual jokes and gags for Sonic games is easy, but I really want a hook, a theme, a central heart to these videos. Some central mistake or concept to tie all the jokes together. And for Sonic Adventure, I didn't really have one for the longest time. Most of the game's narrative is all about establishing the universe, more than any other game. Like, the 6 main storylines at the beginning is all about putting the cast in their natural default place in the world, and then going on. Amy's doing the groceries, Sonic's jumping around looking for trouble, Tails working on his inventions, Knuckles protecting the Master Emeralds, Big being a random civilian, and Eon 2 giving an insight of what it's like to be part of Dr. Eggman's army. It's all about establishing the universe and the characters, while the plot of chaos slowly reveals in the background. Which is great, but not really parody material. The only thing I knew I had to do was doing as they call it, a Rashomon plot. Rashomon plot? That's the same story is told from different perspectives, contradicting each other. I never saw the original Japanese movie. I'm mostly familiar with the concept from a hilarious Invader Zim episode. And no, I did not get the idea from that Sonic Boom episode. That one aired when I was already far into the production of this video. And even without seeing the Invader Zim one, I probably would have done something like this anyway, because Sonic Adventure itself already plays with Rashomon elements, although very subtle. Most notably that Eggman barely acknowledged Tails and Sonic's story and then puts an unnatural emphasis on him during Tails' plot. I always loved looking at the cutscenes from different characters and trying to figure out why some details are different, because often the details are really small. For example, in Sonic's story, Eggman says, "Adieu, until we see again, my friend, ha," when he leaves. In Knuckles, he just says, "We shall meet again." As if, like, in the real world, Eggman truly did say adieu, but Knuckles doesn't understand the French word, but he did figure out what Eggman was trying to say through context, so in his mind, he just replaces the word with something he knows. Or Sonic calling Amy a pain in his own storyline, but from Amy's perspective, he just calls her weird, a much softer and more affectionate insult. So from there, the idea was born to give everyone an exaggerated version of their story and really climb into their heads. But that idea by itself wasn't really enough for me to start working on the parody, mostly because it doesn't really have the satirical elements. Like, it's not really making fun of actual things that happen. It's more like I'm taking a concept of the game and I kind of make it my own. And these parodies aren't really meant to be about me and my thoughts. It's more about me making some sort of statement or point about the original material. Doing crazy things with the characters kind of missed that satirical element. So I didn't really feel comfortable tackling this parody yet, and mostly dismissed it. And what finally did motivate me to go take this parody more seriously later on was when I suddenly realized that, hey, we have this army of Knuckles' raging war against Chao. Well, okay, technically that wasn't a real war yet, but still, the idea of having all these buff, intense warriors having this dramatic assault on what's essentially just a bunch of babies was just too perfect in my head. So as soon as that visual appeared in my head, I knew I had to animate at least these past sequences. However, I figured this would only be funny when it shows up in the context of the full story. That if I only make this as a separate sketch, focusing on this idea alone, it wasn't quite as funny. I don't know why. I think it's because this hilariously one-sided war is more funny when it's really the core, the heart, the entire soul of the entire adventure. So then I finally started to put all those separate ideas I had in a core concept. First, the 6 stories. One thing I learned from Sonic Lost World in minutes and Sonic Shattered Crystals in minutes is that most of my audience has severe trouble when jokes work on a more meta concept, when the humor comes from outside the direct story, with like the art style and animation collapsing in Lost World, or pretty much the entirety of Shattered Crystal being sarcastic and the real humor not being about the jokes Sonic and friends were actually making, but more about the context in which they did. So I knew for Sonic Adventure that I couldn't just throw my audience into these 6 stories without some in-context logic. I had to devise some sort of umbrella plot where the 6 different stories would naturally come from. So I went with the usual suspects, kind of set up with the cast being interrogated by the police. I was very uncomfortable and unhappy with the setup because it's not really connected to the real story of the game, and it's entirely my own constructs. So there were no direct observations or jokes possible. At worst, it had no narrative value. We already know the cast is innocent and that Chaos Monster is responsible for the damage, so there couldn't be much of a conclusion to this side story. So at the beginning, it was just a temporary concept I had to at least give the 6 stories a reason to be told. I was waiting for a better idea to replace it with. So then, the parody as it was had like 3 entirely different parts, chunks to it that didn't really click together. You have the interrogation part, which was pointless and didn't really go anywhere, but I needed it to create a structure. I had the 6 individual storylines, none of which had a very strong satirical point or purpose, and it's just mostly separate ideas that was just purely about me being silly and just having fun with the concept. And then there's the finale, the only aspect that really had the satirical tone that I'm really looking for, but now it's all ridiculously epic and dramatic, and so yet again in a completely different sort of atmosphere than the rest of the video. So, 3 different aspects that had little to no connection to each other. I desperately needed something to tie them all three of them together. What finally ended up being the key, the cement, the mortar to these concepts was when I was thinking about Chaos' motivation. So in the past, the echidnas attacked the Chow, and that sent Chaos into a rage and he destroyed the echidnas. Right, end of the story. So then he was revived later on and went on yet another rampage, even though now no Chow were hurt anywhere in the story. I'm not sure if the games or Sonic X ever gave a real explanation to that. Regardless, when I was playing with that thought, I suddenly remembered a joke Alexandra, my occasional partner from Evil Doc, once made about Chow being forced to eat animals to grow. So then visions of players torturing Chow in the Chow Garden started to pop up in my head, and then I realized, hey, what if that's Chaos' motivation? That Sonic and his friends were screwing around the Chow Gardens and hurting them, and that's why he goes on a rampage. With that thought, all of a sudden, all 3 of those parody elements were suddenly connected with each other. Now, despite the 6 stories being mostly self-contained collections of random jokes, I could add a few jokes about Chow getting hurt, which naturally leads to Chaos destroying the world in the end. And even better, now the gun interrogation had a conclusion, because Sonic and friends actually were partly responsible to the town's destruction, so you actually have that moment of realization from, oh, they actually are connected to the crimes at the end. So now I finally had a main structure in place. So now I could start working out on the details. First, the UN sections were detached from the main story, and I couldn't have direct parody jokes, so I had to figure out something to do with them. I figured that since the section ends with Sonic and friends possibly getting arrested at the end, that it could be a fun tie-in to Sonic Adventure 2 that starts with Sonic in custody. So I started in throwing more Sonic Adventure 2 elements in these sections. I didn't really like those jokes, I'm not super happy with them, but at least it gives some sort of flavor or point to it. And then the 6 main stories, again, Lost World and Shattered Crystal parodies, taught me that I need to be really careful in how to introduce my audience into thinking more abstract and non-linear. So I designed the first 3 stories that they introduce the audience to the concepts one by one. So first you get Sonic, who with the extreme different art style makes a very clear distinction between reality and this mental universe. The Sonic story remains the closest to what truly happened in the original video game, so for now the audience is only introduced to the concept that the main cast will retell the Sonic Adventure story in an exaggerated comedic fashion. Then you go to Tails, who has the exact same style and plot like Sonic. This is so that the audience is forced to focus on that the only new element now introduced that Tails' story contradicts Sonic. To introduce the idea that the stories aren't like jigsaw puzzles that fit neatly together, but they overwrite and contradict each other. And then you finally go to Knuckles, who introduces another new art style and change in genre and atmosphere. to introduce the final concept that the flashbacks aren't told in one general style, but you're really diving into each character's individual interpretation, which can result in a completely different approach. I find that very important so that the finale, that is ridiculously epic compared to the first half of the movie, it doesn't feel completely alien, because now I already introduced the concept that the parody approach will be changing styles drastically, so it doesn't come entirely out of the blue when something weird happens in the final half. Okay, so the individual styles. Sonic and Tails style would be the same. First, again, so I can keep the audience focused on getting the concept of the movie step by step. But it just makes sense for the characters. Tails is all about being an indirect competition with Sonic all the time. It's all about him trying to catch up and eventually outgrow Sonic. So him competing directly with Sonic, even in terms of narrative style, just made too much sense not to do it. Not to mention, I can be a little more lazy, which is always good. So yeah, I gave them the old Sonic in Minutes humor style from my old movies. First, because that's a nice contrast between the real world and the world in their minds. It's also because I knew the first side stories weren't going to be very funny, because most of the interest in humor comes from watching how the story mutates and gets corrupted and twisted through all the stories. So the opening segments would be the most boring ones, because I'm mostly just setting up the situation as it was in the actual game, so that the later stories can turn them more into jokes. And the old in-minute style is like a perfect way to kind of hide the fact that there's no real jokes happening. It's like the style itself makes it feel like there's jokes going on even when there really aren't. And the final reason why I used the in-minute style is because I thought it fits with Sonic and Tails' state of mind. That is, at least in the logic of the parody, most of the things happening in their story here happened out of their control, with Knuckles making the ship tilt and such. So Sonic and Tails genuinely having little idea what happened. I figured that their ego and their hyper energy just makes them cover up their lack of knowledge with pure bravado. You know, that it's kind of cover up all the holes in their own story by just acting cool about it. Although I did make a mental note to myself that I had to avoid making them too much like bros, so I deliberately added moments of them being concerned about each other and such. After all, there needs to be room for corruption for when Eggman's version of Sonic and Tails enter the cartoon. And yeah, Chao Karate isn't in Sonic Adventure 1, only in the second one. I desperately looked for a third Chao getting hurt joke, but I couldn't come up with any. At first I thought about Chao showing up to be punched, but he's also from Adventure 2 and technically a robot, so that made even less sense. Yeah, this parody is a mix between Adventure 1 and 2 anyway, so Chao Karate it is. Then, Knuckles. I went for the film noir approach. It works because Knuckles is all about narrating to himself like a detective, his entire story being about figuring out the truth of the mystery of the Mastering Emerald, and this whole feeling detached and alone in the city vibe works perfectly fine with Knuckles. Not to mention with the fog, that's like a nice symbolic representation of Knuckles himself, that he's extremely single-mindedly focused on his mission and all the details and context around him are obscured in fog. When I think of Knuckles, I kind of think of my dad. My dad is like the kind of man who, when he visits me in my apartment, he's extremely uncomfortable just sitting there socializing. That's just not in his personality. So he's constantly looking for a job to do, constantly walking around the apartment looking for something that's broken or needs to be cleaned or fixed. Just desperately looking for something so he has a sense of purpose and can go to work on that, completely oblivious to how socially awkward that may be or uncomfortable it makes the hosts. That's kind of my approach to Knuckles. Not so much to make him dumb, per se, more that he's overwhelmed and intimidated by the world and feels uncomfortable just interacting with it, so instead he completely and utterly embraces his duties, devoting all his energy and brainpower and obsessing over his job, because that's the only way he can create his own little corner in this complicated world where he has control over. So with his film noir parody thing, whenever he interacts with people that fit in his personal little narrative and how the world works, he respects them and they become like genuine parts of his film noir story in his head, like Chaos or when Eggman's tricking him. Eggman says all the right things Knuckles wants to hear. But when he's confronted by someone who doesn't fit in his own little worldview, like Sonic being more bold and forcing Knuckles to be more self-aware, his brain just dismisses him. Just Sonic being insane and talking his alien language again, whatever. So that was kind of the approach to the Knuckles segment. To be honest, I was really surprised how many people considered this the funniest part. I feared it was really boring, because there's not many jokes. It's just more the style being weird. I think it's the Sonic Colors effect, that people love this approach to Knuckles, mostly because people are just tired of Knuckles being a complete brain-dead moron, so that any interpretation of his characters, even when it still depicts him as a simpleton, immediately hits the right spot, as long as he's just some level of competency is going on for him. I don't know. But yeah, as I said in the movie, Tropical Thunder, never go full retard, make stupid characters a little slow, a little unfocused, a little weird, but never completely off the rails. That's just annoying. Same with Knuckles, he's simple, he's hot-headed, he's extremely awkward and lost outside of his very specific comfort zone, but he's not, again in the words of Tropical Thunder, a full retard. Right, E102 Gamma. If I wasn't the creator of this animation, I was just entirely just the audience of this cartoon, I think this is the thing that would get the biggest reaction out of me. The bait and switch of E102 and the bird. Because right from the beginning I would be constantly wondering about that. If all the 6 main characters are supposedly are here for interrogation, what are they gonna do with E102? Will they ignore he's dead, or make his death appear later, or ignore him? So I deliberately set up the idea that E102 is there. I show him in the newspaper clippings at the beginning, deliberately obscure part of the table where everyone is sitting, implying that he might be behind that thing here, and then have him called out and the music starts to play with his portrait, and only then it's revealed, oh, it's just a bird. Now, I didn't have any specific jokes or anything to do with E102, although to be fair, I had none for any of the characters, but yeah. Eggman just seemed to be more interesting to explore and have fun with than E102. Especially because he's a robot, so he can't lie or exaggerate or misinterpret anything, so it wouldn't make much sense for his flashback to be corrupted or weird. So I went with Eggman instead. The fun thing with Eggman is that even though he's the only one of the gang who's deliberately lying, his story is actually the closest to the truth. With all the other characters, I imagine it's just them misremembering things, or their egos or lack of self-awareness corrupting their worldview. Eggman is the only one who really knows what happens, but he's sliming to the general to avoid trouble, of course. Now, the annoying part is that while working on this project, the Sonic Boom TV show was running, and in that time I started to become really bored and annoyed with Sonic and Eggman being buddies in every episode. Kind of steals the comedy and drama of the setup when it happens every single time, so by the time that show was over, I was kind of miserable about this whole story beat. Eggman being all slimy and helpful, it's a little too Sonic Boomish. Then again, it's not like I'm really against Eggman being slimy and manipulative, fake friend. That's a genuine, real part of his character, and it is funny. So it's not like I'm against his interpretation, it's just that I got really bored of this aspect by this point. It was utilized way too often, which is why, as some sort of counterbalance, I decided to add his super epic dramatic entrance in the second half of the movie, to have some sort of anti-Sonic Boom moment to counteract this bit. Anyway, yeah, his art style, it's very close to how I draw the reality in this cartoon, implying that Eggman, unlike Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, has a way better grasp on what truly happened. The only mutation going on is Eggman and Chaos being more chibi and cute, and Sonic and Tails being these monsters, representing Eggman mutilating their personalities in his lies. I was thinking of drawing E102 and E101 in a more affectionate way too, but I realized this is pretty much the only time in the entire cartoon, and possible all the cartoons I ever make, that E102 would make a physical appearance. So I decided that for his one and only appearance in my cartoons, I should probably just draw him straight. There's actually a huge story I could tell about E102 and how I moved him a lot in this cartoon to try and cover up a plot hole, but only caused more plot holes in the process. But I don't think I'm going to talk about that right now. Maybe if I ever make a dissected video about plot holes, I will. But long story short, late in production, I decided to add this moment where Sonic destroys E102 because I was concerned that some audiences might be confused why E102 is a bird in the present and we never see his proper death on screen. But by putting his destruction here, I caused a chain reaction of plot holes for a freaking character that barely has 10 seconds of screen time. But yeah, I'll talk about that some other time. Amy Rose. She was the hardest for me to figure out what style to use. A detective story would make the most sense considering her quest to find a bird's parents, but Knuckles already had that covered. Some boy meets dog kind of story or a romantic comedy were alternative ideas, but neither genre was really strong and clear enough as an aesthetic. It wouldn't be particularly funny. Then I was thinking of doing it like a slasher horror movie, because Zero's constantly crashing through the walls and chasing Amy like a deranged horror villain. But a horror slasher movie aesthetic doesn't work with Amy at all. Then it has to be all dark and uncomfortable, and people die, and Amy would have been some dumb, stupid bimbo slasher girl. And I'm sure people would love to argue that Amy is a dumb bimbo, but, you know, Amy's the one telling this story right now, and it makes no sense she would portray herself as a dumb bimbo while Sonic may be listening. After a while, I ignored the style approach first, and I just went through what art style to use, and for some reason her dress and hairband gave me a 60s vibe. And I was thinking of Nobody Lives Forever, there's this groovy 60s spy parody thing, and then that style just clicked. A spy movie is also a bit like a detective story, solving mysteries. It works with Amy's entire "my life is so boring, I want adventure" concept. Her hairstyle and dress just screams 60s. Zero could be like a Jaws or some kind of Bond villain. Amy's groovy music theme. It just all fits so perfectly together, so I went for it. I used the spy concept as an excuse to give her a utility belt, mostly because I hate drawing dresses. I just can't draw dresses. They always feel so shapeless and weird. I really hated drawing Princess Elise with a white dress, so giving Amy a weird utility belt made it feel better. Yay, cheating with drawing! Not to mention having a little foreshadowing when the hookshot appears out of nowhere. It wasn't a holster all along.
Also Bond's gadget parody thing, so there.
Anyway, the art style with Amy is also close to how I depict the regular world in this cartoon. Instead of corruption of the artwork, in her story comes more from that the colors are a little weird and alien. Like, instead of using the primary colors blue, red, yellow, and green as core, I went for a more off-kilter alternatives, pink, magenta, turquoise, 80s neon colors, to evoke the more crazy color schemes of Sonic CD and Chaotix and such. The idea is that it represents Amy's mind in that, unlike Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, who have a little understanding of the world around them and make up their own stories, or Eggman, who's deliberately lying, the idea with Amy is that she's genuinely telling the truth, at least as far as she's aware. She just happens to be a little delusional and misinterprets her world incorrectly. Therefore, the art style looks straightforward and correct, but the colors are off. However, I had trouble getting the colors right. I hated how it looked in the first few shots. It looked a little too alien. So then I cheated and made her other sequences take place at night. So the weird off-kilter colors made more sense in context. It's all artificial lightning in the city. And it also makes her story feel more disconnected from the others, which makes sense. Her story is more removed from the others. Though yeah, by using the night, the weird colors were normal again, so I missed my own point. So then I went with a morning aesthetic, a nice compromise between the alien colors and a contextual excuse why the colors are weird. Having my cake and eating it too. The Tikal sequence. This is actually a remake of a joke I made before with Evil Duck. And yeah, it happens in the actual game. Tikal's sending Amy off in a flashback while she's hanging on for dear life. Originally, this was Tikal's first appearance in the entire cartoon, but I felt it compromised the style of Amy's story too much. The problem is, I'm really asking a lot from my audience here, because there's so many layers you need to keep track of. What the real game's events are, what the parody version of the truth is, then what the parody version of the characters lying and misrepresenting their world is, which character is talking, how corrupt are they, how it relates to the character, how it relates to the events, how it happened in the game. There's so many layers going on, so I have to put in real effort at keeping all those elements straight. So here you have Tikal showing up out of nowhere and being pointless, which is immediately several jokes at the same time. The randomness, the pointlessness, how it connects to the game, that it happens to Amy while she's in the middle of an action sequence. I felt that the random humor is a bit out of place with Amy. The jokes and events in her story segment should all be focused on either her personality or the spy theme. So at the last minute, literally pretty much, I did this 15 minutes before I uploaded the movie on the internet, at the last minute I quickly animated the sequence of Tikal showing up in Sonic's story first, which was in the script.
The advantage of the crappy artwork, I can do it fast.
So by having Tikal show up randomly in Sonic's segment, the randomness and pointlessness aspect of the joke now happens with Sonic's story segment, which is designed to be more crazy and random to begin with, so that when Tikal returns in Amy's segments, the audience is already familiar with Tikal being random and pointless, and now instead the joke is much more focused on how it affects the spy exit scene. So yeah, that's one random example of me having to move around jokes or weaken them in order to keep the style and theme of each of the story segments as pure and clean as possible, because the story structure is already a convoluted mess. Big the Cat. I'm so tired of Big the Cat jokes. Positive, negative, it's overkill. My later attempt on sabotaging Big the Cat jokes, immediately pushing it to its extreme, also backfired. Yeah, I got nothing for or against Big. I can take or leave him, but I was just so tired of jokes around him that I deliberately kind of sidestepped him. Originally, I had a short animation section for him too. His style would be that I drew him in a real notebook and then scanned it in a computer and animate it to make it look classy and old, like an old-timey textbook illustration. But at the time I was finishing this movie, I lost my camera, so I couldn't get to drawing on my computer, and I really wanted to have this movie done within 2015. So now Big Segment cuts off in the dialogue section. Might as well, it was a predictable joke. When you do a Retchman parody, you always have to have the stupid character be hyper-intelligent in one of the versions. It's comedy law, so I paid my respects to the laws of comedy and then quickly moved on. Sorry, Big. But yeah, if Big was allowed to finish his story, he would have said the full and complete truth and everything that happens, because of course. Which finally leads to the meat and potatoes of this video, the epic stuff. Essentially, most of this fragment is treated like a music video. Like, as an animator, I'm usually very dull and straightforward. A writer's animator, as I call it. Character needs to punch something, or some action beat needs to happen, so it happens. Flat shot, flat movement. This happens, so it happens. Quick, efficient. It's about the idea of what happened and why. But then you get the few moments where I don't animate like a writer, but animate it like a music video director. I take a song, keep listening to it over and over and over until all the beats, the melody or rhythm, the movement of the music is analyzed and taken apart by my brain. And when I listen to the music, I see the camera moving, the characters moving, the emotions, the rhythm. The music for the Echidna attack is War from the Avatar movie, the blue alien one, not the airbender one. Problem when you just go blindly search for epic music on YouTube or something is that most epic music has very little change in intensity or emotion. It's just this big one lump of epic noise. What I like about this Avatar track is how it moves and twists and turns like a roller coaster. You have the savage building march, the build up and goes faster and faster, and then it goes down and becomes a full-on assault. And then you get this, my god, what have you done? Melody explodes from it, and I can just visualize the camera zooming out over the battlefield and hopelessly staring at the carnage. Then a savage fighting music comes back, but with a sad, tragic undertone comes up, like an overwhelmed soldier watching his world fall apart. Man, I just listened to the song a few hundred times until this entire scene was already animated in my head. I should almost just credit this track, not so much as background music, but practically the director of this entire scene. Ah, poor Can Panders. Usually I try to have my jokes always work on two layers, like the specific nerdy reference, the actual satirical point, the parody, so that all the jokes also work on a more basic neutral level, just simple stupidity or irony, so that even people who are not familiar with the source material can still puzzle together why something is funny. This Can Panders joke is probably one of my biggest betrayals of this approach.
Already a very nerdy reference, and it doesn't really fit comfortably in the situation either. Why is there a random guy in this fight sequence? So I'm not entirely sure about this thing.
Then again, the context was just too perfect not to do it. In case you don't know, Can Panders is a writer from the American comics, but never quite understood that he's part of a team, one writer of the larger world of Sonic, so he's super self-obsessed. So he credits himself to the idea of other echidnas existing and start to cause trouble and sue everyone whenever other echidnas appeared outside of his own stories. Since I don't see myself ever doing a Sonic Archie parody anytime soon, and I already did a Sonic Chronicles parody with Evil Doc before I was aware of the Panders situation, so this was probably the only opportunity I had to ever do anything with Panders. So here it is, bone for the comic book fans. So yeah, this scene. I watched some internet movies before, particularly the Nostalgia Critic Anniversary movies. Impressive and well made, but one detail that always nagged me in these videos is how the serious sequences never feel natural in the rest of the movie. They really had a different tone and a different approach. And Dog has a tendency to end practically all of those sequences always with a deflation moment. Music swells up, character says something dramatic, and then something stupid happens or is said, and the moment deflates and collapses. Those moments already feel so out of place that I realized my brain was constantly waiting for that deflation moment. Every time something serious happens, I'm immediately taken out of the movie because my brain is just waiting for that deflation moment. So when I was working on this, I was worried about that myself. I also have the tendency to have more intense moments or action scenes always end with an anticlimactic beat. That's the ultimate punchline, and that's indeed funny and a great punchline, but I started to get worried if I was overdoing that, if the audience was constantly waiting for that deflation moment. That's why I made a real conscious decision not to do that here. No wacky slapstick finishing move, no observing Sonic S going, "Whoa, that was dark for a children's game, what a plot hole." Nothing. I may sacrifice a joke here, but in order for the jokes in later action sequence to have more power, to keep the audience on their toes, I just had to break tradition. I had to break expectation. Just let the audience take on the whole scene without the expected punchline. After all, it's called a punchline. I take that very literal. As a comedian, you're in a boxing match with your audience. You need to surprise them. Don't telegraph your punches, surprise them. Nothing kills a comedian more than being predictable. So for the first time, I had no comedic button, no stupid punchline, no slapstick, nothing to tie this scene up in a nice comedic fashion. I let it progress to its natural state. Let the audience for once desperately look and wait for a punchline that doesn't come. Not to mention, it just perfectly sets up the finale. Sink the whole movie in the deepest hole, just so when the heroic action beat starts, we fly right out of it. If you want your heroes to soar through the heavens, you need to send them through hell first. Originally, there was a comedic beat at the end of the sequence, but I took it out for being a little too dark and out of character. When Tikal revealed Baby Knuckles to be around, originally the Chow were more clearly dead and Baby Knuckles was kicking their corpses, prompting adult Knuckles to go, "Yeah, you go, mini-me!" But yeah, that felt a little too dark and make Knuckles extremely mean-spirited, so I decided against it. And now adult Knuckles remains in a state of shock. The Chow are implied to still be alive to some degree, and Baby Knuckles only getting himself hurt. So karma's restored. Anyway, yeah, this whole Chow massacre. It was a personal experiment. There was a war going on with comedy versus serious, that the two can't coexist. Either it's super serious or it's a complete farce. And this whole sequence is almost an Exosaga level of weird mixture between both. A serious scene at its core, done in a parody style, but I never betray or corrupt the point or dramatic value of the sequence. What happens really happens and has consequences, funny or not. Like making a big statement of, hey, comedy and serious can coexist. You know, laughing, finding something amusing is not an alien emotion that's separated from the rest. Life is complicated, and things that are funny can still have serious consequences. And yeah, as some people pointed out, Knuckles kind of appears in this flashback out of nowhere. I should have drawn him in the background with Sonic and Tikal there. Not to mention, Eggman should also have been in the flashback, just like Knuckles is. In hindsight, it could have been a funny joke if Eggman stood in the background staring at his carnage and making notes for future evil plans. That would have been amusing. Alas, I didn't think of it. Okay, final little anecdote for this scene. The Echidna massacre is actually the very first thing I animated. Well, from the moment where the general screams I had big on. Usually when I make these cartoons, I make them chronologically, just start at the beginning. But I learned for myself that the longer I work on a project, the more the art quality starts to collapse. So at the beginning, I animate slower and stay more on model, but as time goes on, I become more and more sloppy and fast. That's why, for the first time ever, I deliberately animated this cartoon out of sequence, starting with the big epic sequences, then the Amy and Eggman, and doing the Hyper, Sonic and Tails sequence as the final bits. So that the changes in art style are now in sync with my own natural progression or regression in quality. The second music segment, Eggman's Assault. Ravelijn thema lied, Ravelijn's theme. It's kind of ironic. This is the first song I got serious complaints about from many people in the audience, that I gave it a lazy music credit and not the full track name. Out of all the lazy credits I ever gave, this one is actually fully accurate. The song really is just called the Ravelijn theme, as far as I know. It's like a long 12 or 22 minute music overture. It doesn't really have specific track numbers. The song is from a Dutch stunt show from the Efteling. Efteling is pretty much the Dutch equivalent of Disneyland. Fairy tale themed theme park that has some insanely epic music for its attractions. Ravelijn is a live action stunt show about Power Ranger style medieval knights randomly finding themselves in a magical alternative dimension where they have to fight an evil wizard and his mechanical dragon. It has a surprisingly convoluted story, even having a highly acclaimed Dutch author writing the show, even though it's mostly just an excuse to have stuntmen jumping around on horses. I think it's because there's also a TV show about it that might explain why it's convoluted, but I never saw that show. Anyway, I thought this song is perfect for Dr. Eggman, mostly because despite it being this epic march, it doesn't sound heroic nor evil. It's not the march of a hero, it's not the march of a villain, it's just this force of nature coming your way, and that's the way I like Eggman the most. In a more layered Sonic story, that is. If it's just a simple Eggman took the emeralds, go punch him in the faces, then fine. But when you do like an epic story with plot twists and such, then I prefer it when Eggman isn't necessarily buddies with Sonic or a straightforward villain, but more this intense force of nature that just happens to complicate matters and causing shit for everyone. Hero or bad guy be damned. It's just his big ego causing havoc. I love that. I was actually saving this song and this whole sequence up in case I ever wanted to make a more straightforward, serious Sonic cartoon. So I kind of wasted it here, where it has this anticlimactic ending kind of ruining it. But as I said before, I felt miserable about making Eggman just a slimy car salesman in the previous section, so that I figured I needed to give him a big epic moment, even if it ends badly for him. Sorry, Dr. Robotnik, I can change and exaggerate things in a parody, but in the end I'm still bound by the true events that happened. Speaking of Dr. Robotnik, I deliberately mostly referred to Eggman with his official Robotnik name in this parody, and have Sonic and friends give him all kinds of egg insults beyond just Eggman. Tiny little writing detail as a nod to how Eggman's name is used in Sonic Adventure before they made Eggman his official name in the West. Supersonic, pretty straightforward. There's a song we all know. Again, super important for me to make it feel natural in a cartoon, so add a little joke so that the audience isn't just waiting for the reflation joke at the end, but that it just feels like a natural part of the parody. A random girl here is a person who randomly asks if her or his character could make a cameo in this movie. Usually I don't encourage asking for cameos because I always forget, but this lucky person just had the right timing, asking it just when I was about to draw a bunch of faceless background characters, so here you are. Now you're eternalized in a Sonic in Minutes cartoon. Hooray! And you never responded to thank me, so, yay. And yeah, the city. I made a very crude 3D model of the submerged town in a 3D program. Wanted to try that out once. I felt bad that I didn't really have many jokes or ideas for this segment to make it interesting, so figured that at least having more fancy camera shots makes it more tolerable to have the sequence last as long as it did.
After all that build-up, I can't really make this sequence short. They'll be even more pathetically anticlimactic. Too much, so...
The anti-climax. Comedic timing, so important.
Another Nostalgia Critic-themed anecdote. In one of his reviews, Master of Disguise, Dog Walker had this thing about a fart joke that kept returning in that movie. Sometimes it was funny, sometimes not, and that fascinated me, so I actually did put some thought into why that fart joke sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, and I realized it was about the timing. Like, whenever the characters were in a conversation together, and you see the bad guy opens his mouth and gets ready to say something, and then whomp, the fart interrupts. That's when the critic found it hilarious. In others, there's usually something slapsticky going on. The bad guy falls in a pool or through a wall or something, and then whomp, no reaction. It was all about the timing, about where the audience brain was. In the middle of a slapstick sequence, you're expecting wackiness, so the fart is just part of what you expect to happen and therefore not funny. But in discussion, especially that magic moment right before a character begins talking, your brain is completely preoccupied and focusing on the dialogue and in what the character is thinking and saying. So when that thought process is interrupted with a fart, it creates a shock effect that makes you laugh. So, what the hell does that have to do with this sequence that involves farts nor talking? Well, I had to choose the perfect moment when to interrupt this sequence for the punchline, so instead of doing that around a joke, so when the audience is expecting crazy stuff, I do it right at the moment of the violent impact, when your brain is occupied in anticipating the violent blow instead. And that concludes the tragic story in how a fart joke taught me how Sonic should crash into a wall. Yeah.
Anyway, the idea of this whole thing was that Chaos, realizing that Chow are still around and humans are nice, ends up being the more instrumental to him calming down than the whole fight was. Hooray, friendship! So therefore, Amy gets to save the day. And yeah, characters from my IMP series make a cameo appearance, because I hate drawing big faceless crowds. Besides, IMP and Sonic run into each other more often in my older movies. Having a cameo Mario and Sonic London Games too, for example, but whatever. Someone in the comments had a good idea about that ending. Said that I should have ended further on, where Sonic escaped the helicopter and jumped out with a yeah and skateboard. In hindsight, I should have done that for the ending. More upbeat. Would have felt more natural going into the end credits with that. Now it feels kind of weird to go from the bitter ending to this dreamlike adventure atmosphere. Oh well, hindsight logic. There's a weird thing going on in my Sonic in Minutes parodies that they often end with Sonic getting hurt. I'm not sure why. I guess it's just the easiest and most natural comedic button, I guess. Oh well. And a slight variation of the Raveline theme for the end credits. I admit these end credits are super self-indulgent and don't really represent Sonic Adventure. More than what I want Sonic Adventure to be, I guess. At this point in time, I was just so bored and irritated by the detached, dull, and low-on-energy comedic interpretation of Sonic going around, and I just really wanted a big ending. Yeah, it's good to have a laugh, be silly around Sonic, but at the end of the day, what we want is a damn adventure. Heroes, villains, danger, daring battles. Make them silly, make them wacky, fill it with goofy energy, sure, but never forget it's an adventure. Yeah, done talking about this, I guess. Anything else? I guess I can talk about the voice cast. People really seem to dislike the voice cast in this one. That's a bit concerning. I thought I had a decent cast. It's funny, I used to do all the voices myself, but that was kind of the point, since I hated dealing with voice actors when I started this series, and now I'm completely locked out of the voice acting entirely. One of the reasons I don't do voices in these anymore is because I fear my voice is too recognizable from Dissected now. I always find it distracting when actors I'm used to hearing in web shows suddenly have to act like a character. Like you're so used to them just talking as an editorial, as a show host, not really as a character. So I feared it's the same situation for me. So I'm out now. Sonic's voice done by Tom. I was originally planning on giving Sonic a completely different voice actor in each story, but Tom did a good job differentiating himself, so it ended up being unnecessary. You can thank him for being the wee back in old sections and improvising the French accent in Amy's story. I didn't think of those. That's the great thing of having animators to do your voices. They can very quickly grasp and correctly improvise on how to make it work. Because Tom is from Sonic Paradox, mostly known from directing the Sonic Heroes musicals. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hire him now because his voice is very goofy. Amy's done by Lindsay. Again, my favorite actress for Amy. Sounds very close to the Adventure Amy. Getting her voice this time was a nightmare. The actress was busy and unavailable for a long time, so I hired a different actress, but she ended up being sick. So I desperately had to rehire Lindsay again a couple weeks before this movie was to be finished. But her equipment was broken, so I got her lines, but they had this horrible noise.
Yes, Sonic. I will prove to you my capability right away.
And by then I had no more time to get new equipment or anything, so I had to hope my audio editing software could clean the lines up, which worked surprisingly well, but now there was a weird echo in the background. So with Amy, I always had very heavy background music to try and cover it up. She also did Chaos the Seductor's voice. Mac returns as Eggman. He's also from Sonic Paradox and has voiced Eggman in any one of my videos since Sonic Lost World, because he can really imitate that Dean Bristow Eggman characteristics. Although he doesn't really have the gruff voice of Dean. So I was kind of looking for a more gruff voice first, but I realized Eggman is mostly slimy car salesman mode in this video anyway, so Mac worked better for that anyway. Master C as Tails. Thought it'd be fun to hire someone from Tails' actual age for the actual boy voice instead of a female voice this time. Also fitting since the Adventure games are the same. Feared I didn't give him much voice direction. I think I should have been more clear that the voice needed to change in the alternative storylines. Oh well, I suck as a voice director. Still, I like the voice in general, so it's a nice, very clear voice. Luke Holy, as usual, is the general. Poor Luke, I think he's increasingly more interested in doing more silly, goofy voices with accents, but I always hire him as the no-nonsense authority figure. Sorry, Luke, I don't want you to do goofy voices. You're too perfect as the eternal, unflappable authority figure. Broccoli is Adventure Knuckles, and some background voices. And I did not notice his name is a pun on broccoli until I just said it, so well done, sir. You surprised me. Being tired of Knuckles being a moron so much, so I wanted to give him a straight voice again. Brock sounds very close to the original, so pretty cool. Then, Brom Emmons as R. Knuckles, or Knuckles whenever he talks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Knuckles ended up being the only character that changed voice actors depending on which storyline it appeared in, although originally I planned the entire cast to constantly jump. The idea of Knuckles talking like Arnold didn't come from me at first. The voice actor, Brom Emmons, and our mutual friend Zodi were planning on an animated series he made all about this Arnold Knuckles. That show never came to be, though, but I love the voice for this Knuckles, so I started asking him to do the voice of my cartoons as well. Although now, again, with Knuckles being so obnoxiously stupid, even in official material, I'm becoming increasingly more reluctant to make him over-the-top stupid in my parodies too, so I'm reversing the process now and gave Knuckles his natural voice. And now it's only when he's corrupted in the other stories or the Echidna Warriors that he becomes Arnold Schwarzenegger again. And before you ask, no, I'm not going to animate their original plans with R. Knuckles. That show would have been very mean-spirited and violent, like pretty much every episode ending with Knuckles brutally murdering the entire Sonic cast, and that's not quite my sense of humor, so I only adapted the voice, nothing else. Tikal being done by Elise. She was a guest in Sonic Dissected once, and I was really impressed by the energy in her voice, which is why I hired her as Tikal, because that massacre scene requires some intense yelling. I think she did a great job. Rugal as this guy. Yeah, that's the voice that was the most problematic, and the one I assume most people refer to when they complain about the voice acting. I didn't quite have the energy needed. And me being a coward as usual, I never got a courage to recast the role. Oh well. I did make him redo his lines a couple more times, but it never got better than what it ended up being, so, yeah. I guess Rugal works better as a growling, intimidating bad guy, and not really screaming madman. It's not his style. Finally, Cole as Zero and Big the Cat. I love hiring Cole as bad guys. He has such an intense voice. He modeled his Big the Cat voice after Cave Guy from Freakazoid. Was against that at first. Big just needed to sound smart, not like an arrogant asshole. But in the end, it sounded well enough anyway, so great fit. Yeah, that's it really. Add a video. I talk longer about the cartoon than the length of the cartoon, because of course... subscribe, worship, praise, devote, adulates, dutify this video and stuff. Bye.